so thank you for being here today. I know most of you or a lot of you already are familiar with what's the Institute of Ostrom, but I'm going to do a very brief introduction for those of you that are not familiar with our organization. So we are a non-partisan think tank that has been around for a little bit more than 3 years. We stand for civil liberties, we stand for open societies, for free markets and evidence-based policy. And our goal, amongst other things, is to have an influence in the public debate. And this is the reason why we regularly organize debates and conferences with people that we believe that are interesting enough to devote our time to. And this is the reason why today we have here Mark Lutter, and he is the founder and the executive director of the Charter Cities Institute, which is a non-profit organization dedicated to creating the ecosystem for charter cities. I'm sure that he'll explain what's the background of that more deeply in a few minutes. Prior to launching the institute, he was the lead economist for NeWAY Capital, which is an asset management firm which made early stage investments in charter cities. And during the graduate school, he also consulted on several new city projects and special economic zones. He has a PhD in economics from the George Mason University, where his research has been focused on charter cities, and he has also published several newspapers and magazines, including City Journal, CityAM, and Cato Unbound. So without further more, please join us in listening to. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Cool. So I'm Mark Lutter. I founded the Charter Cities Institute about 2.5 years ago, and what we do is we work to create charter cities. So I'd like to start this talk with a quote. Let me actually. So, make no little plans, they have no magic to stir men's blood. This is by Daniel Burnham, who is a architect and urban planner who lived at the turn of the 20th century. He designed the Flatiron Building in New York, if you guys are familiar with that. He also helped design the urban plan of Chicago, as well as the urban plan of Manila, and the downtown urban plan of Washington, D.C. And I like this quote because I think recently humanity has forgotten how to make bold plans to a certain extent. If we look at some of the technological innovation that took place at the first half of the 20th century, things like the automobile, internal combustion, electricity, airplanes, these really changed the way we live and how we work. And over the last 40 years, we've seen the changes, but they've been relatively minor in comparison, mostly information technology, computers, television, and the internet. And more selfishly, the reason to, I think bold, at least from my perspective, is that charter cities are a relatively bold idea. And so stirring people to have big vision, I think, is important. So what is a charter city? What we've seen in the last 40, 50 years is several cities basically go from almost nothing to become world-class cities. So like Dubai, Singapore, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, these came out of effectively desert or small fishing villages to become global metropolises. And the Charter Cities Institute, we believe that we can replicate this success throughout the world and develop a model. So a charter city is a new city with a special jurisdiction that allows it to improve their business environment. We view this as having 4 key components. 1, a greenfield city. So this is a new city being built from scratch from the ground up. 2 is independent administration. So a new independent administrative body that then governs the city. This doesn't mean sovereign. This doesn't mean a city-state. Instead, this means something like the central bank, where you have a body that's generally removed from the political process, that's able to execute as effectively as they can on the city administration. Third, you have the devolution of authority to the city level. So ideally what happens is the Constitution remains the same, international treaties remain the same, criminal law remain the same, but all other authority is devolved to the city government. This means things like labor law, tax administration, business registry, land registry, environmental law, education, et cetera, all is decided on the city level. Lastly, we believe dispute resolution is important, so setting up courts that allow for quick, fair, and effective dispute resolution for commercial disputes. Now, the problem that charter cities are trying to solve is one of urbanization. So there's over 70 million new urban residents annually. That's the equivalent of about 10 Hong Kongs. And these new urban residents aren't in places like Barcelona, Madrid, or London. They're often in Africa and Asia. 90% of these new urban residents are occurring there. So places like Lagos currently has a population of 20 million. I had a meeting with a journalist in London, and he described Lagos as post-apocalyptic New York, which I thought was a relatively apt description. It has an incredible amount of energy and very smart people. And when I was there, I visited the apartment of a governor, the former governor of a state in Nigeria. It's one of the nicest buildings in Lagos, or one of the nicest streets, one of the richest streets in Lagos. And the street outside, there were potholes that were about a foot deep. And so if the richest street in Lagos can't afford to pay their potholes, what's going on? And the answer is they probably could. They could pressure the city government to pave them, or even they could come together and pave them themselves. But the reason why they chose not to, at least I suspect, is to make it more difficult for kidnappers to speed away. We visited a music star in Lagos, and he lived in a gated community, and he had hired his own guards because he didn't trust the guards in the gated community. And Nigerians, for example, they have out of American immigrants, the Nigerians have the highest educational attainment, so higher than Japanese, higher than Koreans, and yet you see Lagos where just because the governance is relatively ineffective, there are these massive problems and challenges to be had. So the idea of charter cities is basically how can you unleash this talent that's currently being trapped in these poor governance systems, and how can you make it more productive for the world? So historically, urbanization and industrialization have tended to go hand in hand. You move to a city, you have access to a larger labor market, you become more specialized, your productivity increases, and even if you start out living in slums, by the end of your life, hopefully you've gained enough wealth and at least your kids won't live in slums, right? Slums were widespread in the US in the 19th century, and now they're basically non-existent. What's happened is this relationship between urbanization and industrialization and productivity increases, it's broken down, at least in parts of the world, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. Instead of people moving to cities to become more productive, to get the benefits of living in this larger labor market, people are moving to cities and they're living off of the rents of natural resource extraction. So the resource extraction, whether it's oil or whether it's copper or diamonds, et cetera, trickles down, and so the people living in cities aren't becoming more productive, but are effectively condemned to lives of continued poverty. So here are some statistics about African urbanization. You can see 1990 and 2030. This is only 10 years in the future. Kinshasa, where's Kinshasa? I'm not sure which one Kinshasa is. Kinshasa must be up here. So Kinshasa is the largest French-speaking city in the world. It's larger than Paris. Paris has a population of about 12 million. Kinshasa has a population of about 13 million. It's the capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there's a song by a pop singer in the Democratic Republic of Congo who references a kid getting electrocuted for peeing in a puddle. Why? Because the infrastructure is so bad that when there are torrential rains, they knock down the electricity poles that then electrify the puddles. And this is, it's probably not a common occurrence, maybe it happens once every few years, but the fact that there is even a joke about kids getting electrocuted from peeing in puddles, I think suggests some need to improve some of the infrastructure there. And the population of Kinshasa is projected to grow to about 30 million by 2050. So how can we provide opportunities for these people who currently, unfortunately, don't have a lot? Now, for the main body of this talk, what I'd like to do is to basically try to convince you that charter cities are actually possible. This isn't just a pie-in-the-sky idea. This has sort of happened before to a certain extent. So the four cities I previously mentioned, Singapore, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and Dubai, I'd like to refer to them as proto-charter cities. They're not full charter cities, they're in some margins accidents of history, but they really show it's possible in 2 or 3 generations to become a world-class city, starting from nothing or almost nothing. Now, Lee Kuan Yew is the person who's most responsible for Singapore as it is today, and he's written a fantastic book called From Third World to First. But I have not seen a book on how to build a nation from out of a disparate collection of immigrants from China, British India, and the Dutch East Indies. Luckily, he wrote that book for us. So Singapore is the only country in the world that didn't want to be a country. They were decolonized in 1963 when the British left and they joined with Malaysia. But 2 years later, they got kicked out of Malaysia. And so at the time they had a per capita income of $4,000. It's interesting reading Lee Kuan Yew's biography because he goes to England and asks, like, what should I do? And they say, well, why don't you form a trade union with some of your neighbors? And his response was, well, Malaysia just kicked us out. They don't want a trade union with us. What should I do? There was also a decent bit of ethnic tension when they became independent, because it's primarily ethnic Chinese, but there's also a large Malay population as well as a British population. So the first thing that he faced was, okay, how do you actually create order, both internal and external? At the time of independence, there were parts of the Malaysian government that thought it was a mistake to kick Singapore out, that wanted to reassert control, but probably with less favorable terms than before. So there was a minority Malay population in Singapore, and there was the risk that if this minority population is abused, or if the Malaysians say they're abused, that can serve as a pretext to basically reconquer or conquer Indonesia or Singapore and bring them into the Malaysian fold. Second, they faced riots internally, and so the first thing he had to do was basically create this security apparatus, and they started recruiting for the army. And then an order went down that said, hey, we're only going to allow citizens to be part of the army. But this was misinterpreted. And so the colonel who was at the training said, okay, all of the Malaysians can go home, even the Malaysians who are Singaporean citizens. So they went home and they started rioting. And luckily they were able to clean up these riots, but then they're faced with a choice. Okay, do we keep these people in prison or do we let them go home? If we keep them in prison, then we're sort of stoking the fears that we're oppressing this minority. If we let them go home, well, they were just rioting. And they decided to let them go home and said, hey, if you're a Singaporean citizen, come back and rejoin training tomorrow for the army. So the people who were rioting in the streets, they, because of the depth of the challenge, they brought them back into the army, into the training system. After attaining security, the second challenge that Singapore faced was building an economy. So when they became independent, they had an unemployment rate of 14%. And 3 years after independence, the British troops, who were supplying about 20% of the economy, decided to withdraw. Luckily, they were at least a little bit prepared because Lee Kuan Yew had visited Malta and seen the economic sort of catastrophe that happened when Britain withdrew from Malta. So they were able to negotiate reasonably favorable terms to keep some of the infrastructure, including the port and the airport. But nevertheless, they lost 20% of their GDP with about 70,000 jobs provided indirectly and directly by the British government. Another challenge that Singapore faced was building up a credibility. So there's this saying where anything that's not explicitly banned, you can do in Hong Kong, but in Singapore, you can only do things that are expressly permitted. And Lee Kuan Yew addresses this by saying, look, Hong Kong was ruled by the British. The British have a history, several hundred years, of respecting rule of law, of these ideas, and so they're able to get away with a little bit more. But Singapore, because it was a new country, because there was no history of commitment to rule of law, of commitment to these ideas, they need to be a lot more careful about what they allowed to build up this set of trust. So one of the things they did was to continue to use the British Privy Council, which is the British court system that would apply to colonies. So they said, look, we realize you might not trust us, we're a new country, but you trust the British, so all of these commercial disputes will be resolved by the British. That lasted until the late 80s when there were several disagreements. Another thing they did was to focus on industrialization. There were several early failures. They built an industrial park where they had trouble getting businesses. And it really began to turn around when Lee Kuan Yew took a trip in 68, 69 to the US and began meeting American CEOs. And he realized that, okay, the way for Singapore to grow was to attract American multinationals, was to create a governance structure that would make it competitive, that would make these companies want to invest in Singapore, want to hire Singaporeans, etc. Another challenge that Lee Kuan Yew faced was building government. And it was actually quite interesting. He spends a little bit less time on this than I thought he would, because we at the Charter Cities Institute are actually thinking about this a lot. How do you actually create a governing apparatus to administer a city? But one of the things that he did was work on, develop the Economic Development Board, which is the first agency that he mentions that's not related to security. And this was responsible for attracting investment, for creating the institutional environment that was necessary for success. They recruited Singaporean students who were studying in the US, in Europe, to really get the top talent there. And today the Singaporean bureaucracy, it's famously well paid, and it's one of the most competent and effective bureaucracies around the world. The outcome, so Singapore isn't really a sort of libertarian utopia. It often scores very high on economic freedom indices, but if you look, the Sovereign Wealth Fund has majority shares in a number of Singaporean companies. The state still has a relatively heavy hand in the government. In the economy, I think about 80% of housing is owned by the Singaporean government and does it relatively effectively. But per capita income is $60,000 annually. They did have some advantages. They were blessed with a visionary leader, Lee Kuan Yew, as well as a very good location, a port that was originally settled by the British in 1819, and happened to coincide with when sort of the gravity of economic activity was moving from west to east towards China and India. The second city I'd like to go over is Dubai. So Sheikh Rashid is the person who's probably most responsible for modern Dubai. And this quote I rather like: "My grandfather rode a camel, my father rode a camel, I drive a Mercedes, my son drives a Land Rover, his son will drive a Land Rover, but his son will ride a camel." And this captures the sort of predicament they were in. When they gained independence from Britain in 1971, they had 30% literacy, they had no universities, and life expectancy was around 50 years. So this would probably be the worst country in the world, or among the worst country in the world with economic sort of statistics if it happened today. And yet they were able to, in part, create a world-class city. So Sheikh Rashid took power in 1958 when his father died, and then he left power after a stroke in 1980. And one of my favorite stories about Sheikh Rashid, when he was a kid and growing up, most of the youth in Dubai, they would go to the little sort of film stores, and they would ask for pictures of Western women in bikinis. He would go to the film stores and he would ask for pictures of London and New York so he could look at the skyscrapers. And this inspired him. So in 1959, he took a trip to London to really view it as a modern metropolis. One of his first acts when he took power was to build the power plant because they didn't have electricity until the early 1960s. They struck oil in 1966, but unlike Abu Dhabi, their neighbor, or Saudi Arabia or Qatar, they were not as lucky in terms of the amount of oil they had. So they realized, and this is where the original quote comes from, that my father rode a camel. They realized that oil would not last them forever, so they had to reinvest the oil wealth to create a broader economy than just oil. So Dubai, its success can be thought of as a series of ever-increasing ambitious bets. So in 1893, Iran raised tariffs on some of their ports. And what Dubai did was said, hey, we have a free port, Persian traders, come over here, and you can continue to trade, but we won't tax you. And so they got 12 Persians to move over to Dubai. And just to give you a sense of the scope, right, this is 1893, and this is worth mentioning in the history of Dubai. 7 years later, in 1900, this happened again, where Iran again raised the tariffs, and Dubai said, hey guys, come over here, and they got 500 Persian traders to move over. They also offered some land to some of those traders. They built, right now they're well known for the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world. But they built a building taller than any in Europe in the year 2000. They built the tallest building in the Middle East in 1980. Perhaps my favorite story about sort of the depth of their ambition is Sheikh Rashid wanted to build a new port. So he hires a firm and they draw up plans. The port will have 4 berths for ships. They present it to him and he says, no, this is too small. I want 16 berths. So they draw up plans for a port with 16 berths and they present it to him. And then he says, no, this is too small. I want 32 berths. And they draw up this plan for 32 berths and they build the port. And then 10 years later, it's too small and they need a bigger one. So Dubai also experimented with a number of special economic zones. They have about 30. And my favorite is the Dubai International Financial Center. So basically in the early 2000s, they realized, okay, we want to attract international finance, but we're under Sharia law. Sharia law doesn't allow for interest. So how do we get financial companies to come and invest and do business here? And what they did was they said, okay, let's just build an entire legal system from scratch. So one of the architects, Errol Hoopman, compares it to the Vatican in the extent that that is the difference level of the laws in the Dubai International Financial System to the rest of Dubai. They basically created a sort of bastardized version of common law, drawing both from British as well as Australian common law, because one of the key architects was Australian. Hired British, Singaporean judges. There's a Hong Kong judge there as well, and now it's one of the top 20 financial centers in the world. It's been replicated in both Abu Dhabi as well as Qatar, and we're seeing countries like Kazakhstan as well as Sri Lanka begin to think about creating their own financial centers. So now Dubai is a global city. This picture, I believe, is from 1980. This picture is probably from 2007, and now it's too small. The buildings are much bigger. The population is about 3.3 million. Less than 5% of their budget is from oil. Less than 10% of the population is Emirati. Most of the population, the skilled workers tend to be European. Recently they've been shifting to middle-income countries like Lebanon, Egypt to draw some of the skilled labor. Unskilled labor often comes from South Asia, like Sri Lanka, India, the Philippines. Another example of a very successful city is Hong Kong. So Hong Kong was originally, the British took possession of it in 1942 as a result of the Opium War. But we're going to start in 1945 after it was reconquered from the Japanese. The Japanese conquered it and occupied it for about 3 years during World War II. And when the British reconquered it, they gave orders to the Chief Civilian Affairs Officer, McDougall. Your objectives are the maintenance of law and order and the prevention of disease and unrest. This will involve, amongst other things, the establishment of a police force, the establishment of military courts, the control as far as possible of the influx of civilians by land and sea. What you're seeing on the screen, this was basically the totality of orders that were given to him. It was, okay, you're taking control of a colony that had a population of about 600,000. There were a number of refugees who had fled during the Japanese occupation. Go build a government, control order, provide rule of law, start an economy, go do all this. And today, it's hard to imagine what this would look like. Can you give somebody the order to do this effectively, and would they even know what it means? So the immediate post-war period was challenging. The population ballooned from 600,000 to 2.1 million in just 6 years. This was in part the return of refugees who had fled Hong Kong during the Japanese occupation. In part, it was because of refugees fleeing the Chinese Civil War at the time. It's quite interesting reading some of the histories of Hong Kong, because typically you think of, okay, if your population increases by 3.5x in a 6-year period, you'll probably have some social unrest. And admittedly, Hong Kong was attracting mostly Chinese refugees. They either had ties to Hong Kong, or at least they spoke the same language. They were of the same sort of ethnic group. But even so, with such a rapid increase in population, my operating assumption is that you'd have some form of social unrest, but Hong Kong was able to really effectively integrate all of these refugees. Now, the person most responsible for Hong Kong's success is John Cowperthwaite. He was the financial secretary from 1961 to 1971, but he arrived in Hong Kong in the immediate post-war era in 1945. And he really exemplified the British approach to Hong Kong. His approach was called positive non-interventionism, which is basically a version of classic liberalism, libertarianism, where he decided, hey, okay, I'm just going to keep my hands off. We're going to provide public goods like courts, like law and order, maybe some infrastructure, and otherwise we'll let the economy take care of itself. And it did, 2 relatively spectacular results. My favorite example of his approach is that he was very resistant to economic statistics being taken because he feared that those economic statistics would be used to justify further government intervention. The economic growth of Hong Kong is also quite interesting. Looking at other East Asian countries, for example, Japan and South Korea, the government played a very heavy role, even in Singapore, a more heavy role than in Hong Kong, in economic development. But Hong Kong, the government played a relatively very small role. So their industrialization began in 1950 with the textile industry, which mainly came from refugees from Shanghai fleeing the Chinese Civil War. In the 60s, they branched out to clothing, electronics, before moving more towards a service sector economy in the 80s and 90s. And unlike South Korea and Japan, which were dominated, their manufacturing were dominated by a small number of industries, Hong Kong manufacturing was dominated by small and medium-sized enterprises. So in 1955, 91% of manufacturing enterprises employed under 100 employees. 1975, it was 96%. So this was really a very small competitive, or small industries, a competitive market. And as I mentioned previously, unlike Korea and Japan, there was really no industrial policy. This was a much more sort of organic type of development. And the outcome, the current per capita income of Hong Kong, purchasing power adjusted, is 64,000. It has a third top 3 financial center in the world after New York and London. The airport is one of the busiest in the world. Of course, they do face challenges. There's the threat from the Chinese government that's putting pressure on Hong Kong, as well as the economy has been a little bit stagnant over the last 20 years. They haven't produced any new major companies. Shenzhen is a lot more dynamic in terms of the companies that are producing and how they're engaging the global economy. Housing prices are quite high in Hong Kong, and it's become a little bit oligarchic to a certain extent. The last city I would like to discuss is Shenzhen. So Deng Xiaoping, who was the premier, the Chinese premier, who helped create Shenzhen, immediately after Mao died, he won a power struggle. And his quote that I quite like, "It doesn't matter if the cat is white or black so long as it catches mice." And this is his way of encapsulating the move away from a much more, I guess, rigid version of socialism to a more broad, pragmatic approach. So Shenzhen in 1979, when it was declared a special economic zone, the myth is it was a fishing village of 30,000 people. In fact, it was several fishing villages and several rural communities with a total population of about 100,000 people. It had a much more bottom-up approach than either Singapore or Dubai, which were both led by visionary leaders, Lee Kuan Yew and Sheikh Rashid. Shenzhen was much more of a sort of organic process that nobody laid out the plan. This is how we're going to do things. They just created this new area and devolved power to it. There was a relatively broad devolution of authority. It wasn't saying this is what labor law is. It was saying here's a special economic zone, and then everybody sort of figured it out over time. So there was an immediate impact with the declaration of the special economic zone. The first year of its existence, this number of fishing villages with a population of about 100,000 attracted over half of all foreign direct investment in China. China at the time had 700, 800 million people, and so this just shows how the power of a set of reforms can do. Second, within 5 years, Shenzhen built the tallest building in all of China. They had 800,000 residents. The original plan in 1980 was to have about 500,000 residents by 2000 in 20 years. 5 years later, they had blown past that number. The linkages between Hong Kong and Shenzhen are also quite important because within the first 7 years, 80% of the investment in the Guangdong province, of which Shenzhen is a part, came from Hong Kong. And the linkages also in terms of knowledge were important because a lot of families had been split by the Chinese Civil War. There were people who would crossed the border to Hong Kong, worked for a few months, returned to Shenzhen, and that knowledge sharing allowed for the rapid sort of build out and industrialization of Shenzhen. Some of the reforms that took place in Shenzhen were labor law, foreign direct investment, land tenure, the price system, and the financial system. My favorite example is labor law, because what happened in Shenzhen ended up being the basis for reforms in all of China. And so there was a joint venture between some Shenzhen merchants, or some Hong Kong merchants, and Shenzhen to create a hotel. And they faced some challenges because the workers were Chinese, and they were used to operating under the communist system. So they said, okay, we will wash the sheets once a week, because if we wash the sheets any more than once a week, it's wasteful. And the Hong Kong investors were saying, no, if you want people to come to the hotel, maybe you should wash the sheets once every day. The workers also didn't want to wear makeup, because makeup is capitalistic and imperialistic. And eventually they reached a compromise that created basically a monthly wage system where each party could withdraw if they saw fit. And this wage system was then used as the basis of reforms for all of Shenzhen. And it was then, the wage system for Shenzhen was then used as the basis of reforms for labor law in all of China. And so they basically had this problem, and they figured out a solution that was acceptable to both parties, that then spilled up, because it was working, to serve as a foundation for lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, like China has done over the last 40 years. One of the interesting things about Shenzhen in relation to Singapore, Hong Kong, and Dubai is it's embedded in this larger political system. Singapore is a sovereign state. Dubai is part of the UAE, but had a deal of power politically. Shenzhen didn't, and so there were conservatives and hardliners in the Communist Party in China who were against the strategy of reforms. And so Deng Xiaoping, who was key in creating Shenzhen in the first place, in 1992, after he had stepped down from power, he was about 89 years old, his successor was thinking about closing the economy and undoing some of the reforms he did. So Deng Xiaoping goes down to Shenzhen to do what's now known as the Southern Tour. He visits Shenzhen as well as a number of other of the special economic zones and cities that opened up politically. And the result of this trip is a number of newspaper articles, a lot of media attention and press coverage that Deng Xiaoping's biographer credits for convincing his successor, Zemin, to not only not close the economy, but also to pursue further reforms. Currently, Shenzhen, it's the manufacturing capital of the world. It has about 20 million residents. From 1997 to 1998, it actually added 1 million residents in 1 year. So it went from about 4.5 million to 5.5 million. There's an astounding level of growth and adding new residents. The per capita income went from about $100 US annually in 1980 to now over $50,000 once you adjust for purchasing parity power. So what lessons can we learn from Singapore, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Dubai, and how do they relate to charter cities? We see 6 key lessons: state capacity, governance, location, urban plan, culture, and the anchor tenant. So state capacity, maybe you guys have seen Tyler Cowen's State Capacity Libertarian essay that came out about a month ago. State capacity is the ability of governments to be able to execute reasonably complex tasks. So my favorite example is in San Francisco, it took the US 3 years to build the Golden Gate Bridge in the midst of the Great Depression. More recently, they tried to build an on-ramp to the Golden Gate Bridge, a 1.5-mile parkway. It took them about 7 years in the late 2000s, because the US government has basically forgotten how to build things. I lived in Honduras for 6 months. When I was in Honduras, I took a bus to El Salvador, and the bus would only leave pretty early in the morning at about 6 a.m. Why? Because if it left later, it would cross the border at night, and there were literal highway bandits who would rob you. So the Honduran government was unable to do the basic function of the state, which is to have a monopoly of force in an area. And unfortunately, many emerging markets struggle with this challenge. The states are unable to provide public goods like law and order, like an open market, like roads, etc. And looking at Singapore, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and Dubai, one of the things that those cities were able to do effectively is provide these public goods. After you get the basic public goods, a state that's capable of providing them, the next important thing is governance. So you might be familiar with this picture. This area right here in the bottom of the map is South Korea. This area that you can't really see is North Korea. There's Pyongyang right there. So, right, the people have the same history, the same language, the same culture, and just in basically what's a 60-year, 70-year period, there's a massive difference in outcome because of governance. Because South Korea has an open market, North Korea doesn't. So more specifically, what governance means is how easy is it to register a business? How easy is it to hire people? How easy is it to trade? How easy is it to invest? Things like that. How easy is it to resolve disputes? And by creating this enabling environment for business, it's possible to go from this, actually North Korea was wealthier than South Korea in the mid-50s, to this in just 2 or 3 generations. Important for charter cities is having a flexible city government. So it's not just saying, okay, labor law is this on the city level, but allowing the city government to be empowered to change labor law. Because even if you get it right on the first go-around, in 5 years, in 10 years, the conditions might change and you might need to make some reforms. But you need to be able to do that without going back to the central government and asking for permission to make those changes. The third important thing to consider is location. So Singapore, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and Dubai were all blessed with good locations. When thinking about charter cities, we think about 3 important aspects for location. One is, where is the urbanization happening? Let's say you build a city in the US. If you build a city in the US urbanization rate is about 80%. That means you're competing with existing cities for new residents. So you're convincing people to move from New York, from Seattle, from Denver, etc., to move to your new city. Versus, if you've got these new urban residents, they're moving from rural areas. It's a little bit easier to attract them because they're moving to a city anyway. Second is, what is the regulatory arbitrage? So if you're building a new city, for example, in Africa, you can create a much better governing system that will allow for more investment, more job creation, more entrepreneurship that can become the most competitive place to do business in the region. Shenzhen, for example, was the most competitive place to do business in China. Dubai was the most competitive place to do business in the Middle East. A third thing to consider is the trade routes. The gravity of trade and economic activity is moving to Asia, but we're also seeing things, for example, in Africa, the Horn of Africa is being built out quite heavily. And climate change will do 2 things. One, it will make some cities around the equator a little bit less livable. That might cause outward migration from those cities. Second, it might make places like Siberia and northern Canada more accessible. So I did some consulting work on a new city development in Kazakhstan, and my pitch to them was, hey, right, you're building a new city. This is a 30-year project. Your pitch should be, we are the gateway to Siberia. If you want to do resource extraction in Siberia, if you want to do agriculture in Siberia, come set up your head of operations here. They didn't like that pitch, unfortunately, but I thought it was a good one. Another thing to consider is the urban plan. So most cities today are vastly overplanned. Again, in Kazakhstan, there was a distinguished professor of urban planning at MIT who said, we can build the financial district here, or we can build it here, we can have tall buildings, we can have medium-sized buildings. And I'm just thinking, look, how do you know where the financial center should be? So my favorite example of an urban plan is New York. If you see, right, lower Manhattan is, most of New York has this very nice grid, except for lower Manhattan. And what happened was, it's known as the Commission of 1811, they actually started it in 1807, but they realized, okay, we're growing very rapidly, so let's come up with some plan to do this. So they drew this grid, which continues to define Manhattan to this day. Today you probably can't do this, you need a little bit more planning. So things like in the early 19th century, the average firm size was quite small, and there weren't these large public utilities like electricity, water, sewage, etc. Now the ports need to be much bigger. You need electricity, water, sewage. And so you probably want to do a little bit more urban planning, but you wouldn't want to overplan. You don't know where everything should be. So you want to have this balance of building out the infrastructure, having a plan, but still allowing the market to be flexible in figuring out what makes the most sense. Another important thing is culture, and this has two aspects. It's one, how do you get an effective administration? And two, how do you ensure that the citizens have a productive culture? So one of the interesting things about going to Dubai is that I've heard people use the term Mars shot there unironically. It's one of the places where people actually are very ambitious. They think big. In the US, if you have global ambitions, you typically go to either New York or to San Francisco. So how do you attract these go-getters? How do you attract these people who want to build things? Also, how do you, if you're building in emerging markets, how do you make this comfortable for people who might be coming from rural areas that aren't used to interacting with the global economy? One of the interesting things looking at new factories that are trying to be staffed by people from rural areas, oftentimes those people don't show up on time. They just have no concept of what it means to show up on time because they're used to living at their own schedule and they're not used to living in this modern economy where time is a thing. So how do you make that transition? Second, how do you create an effective administration that's able to provide these public goods, that's able to deal with challenges as they emerge? The last aspect that we think is important is the anchor tenant. So if you think about a shopping mall, shopping malls have an anchor tenant, which might be a department store like Macy's or Target, etc., that brings everybody in the room, in the mall. So they charge a lower per square foot price typically to that department store, and then a higher square foot price to the food court, to the jewelry store, because the department store attracts people, and then they spend money in other places as well as the department store. So if you think about a charter city, okay, what should that anchor tenant be? Who's going to create that first 1,000 jobs? Because nobody wants to live in an area where nobody else lives. So who creates that first 1,000 jobs that can justify this initial infrastructure investment, that can justify building a small grocery store, building a restaurant, etc.? And the way we think about it is look at what economic activity is already taking place in that country. Maybe they are doing textile manufacturing, so the charter city should have some textile manufacturing. Maybe they don't have any industrial capacity, but they're producing palm oil. So then maybe you do some palm oil manufacturing there to start. You want to focus on industries that have positive spillover effects that allow the city to move up the value chain over time. So to conclude, I'd want to go over a brief history of charter cities and to understand the space and where we are today. So there's sort of two strains in charter cities thought. Paul Romer, he originated the term charter cities in a 2009 TED Talk. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics a year and a half ago. He had opportunities to do a charter city in Madagascar and Honduras. He met both presidents. The Madagascar president was deposed in a coup, unrelated to the charter cities. And Honduras, Paul Romer left after the government signed a memorandum of understanding with the private company. And after that, Paul Romer basically stopped publicly talking about charter cities. You also, in Silicon Valley, had the Seasteading Institute and folks interested in competitive governance. The Seasteading Institute wanted to build floating autonomous cities. They were less concerned about trying to alleviate third world poverty and more concerned about how to build new institutions that might be better than the American government. Honduras passed legislation in 2011. The Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. They passed new legislation that the Supreme Court agreed was constitutional. So I've seen a number of companies go to Honduras, but so far there hasn't really been any traction. And part of the reason I started the Charter Cities Institute is I got tired of going to conferences and hearing the same 5 people talk about the same 2 projects with no progress being made. So what we're seeing is a small and growing community. We have the Charter Cities Institute. This is a dam. Its picture is like 2-3 years old. For Nkwashi, it's a city development that we're working with in Zambia. Now, if you go, there's a large reservoir, a very nice lake there. And they're building for 100,000 residents on 12 square kilometers. So our sort of insight was, okay, charter cities are awesome, but look, people are already building new cities. So rather than try to do everything ourselves, let's just go talk to the people building new cities and work with them to figure out how to improve governance. In Yimba Economic City, we had a Charter Cities business plan contest. Yimba Economic City is a new city development in Nigeria. It's being built on 95 square kilometers for 1.5 million residents. Pronomos Capital is a venture capital fund run by Patrick Friedman, who founded the Seasteading Institute. They are doing early stage investments in charter cities. Politas Consulting is a consulting firm that helps with special economic zones and charter cities. Free Private Cities is run by Titus Gebel, a German entrepreneur who is taking a little bit more of a libertarian Rothbardian approach to what he calls free private cities, but I think are relatively adjacent to charter cities. The current constraints on charter cities, one is just a lack of knowledge. So what we see is there's a lot of groups, people, stakeholders that are interested in charter cities, but are sort of approaching the idea and don't have it fully fleshed out. So they don't know what steps to take. So our strategy at the Charter Cities Institute broadly is to build a giant beacon that sort of broadcasts charter cities so that these stakeholders can come and reach out to us and we can figure out how to work together with them. A second challenge is politics, right? Governments don't want to devolve authority to a special jurisdiction. So how do you convince governments to do this? It's often very easy on the first conversation to get governments excited, but then when it comes to actually agreeing to these plans, it can be a little bit more challenging. We're seeing, I think the conversations go better than they would have 5-6 years ago, and the tide is slowly turning. And what we're trying to do at the Charter Cities Institute is just make charter cities cool. Everybody wants to build their own city. Egypt wants to build a new capital. Indonesia wants to build a new capital. And if they're thinking about building a new city, then how about also think about these governance reforms that can improve the business environment? Third is capital. So charter cities are very capital-intensive projects, right? If you're building a new city, you probably need a few $100 million for infrastructure build-out, for a port, a power plant, et cetera. So how do you make sure that there are capital flows lined up for both early stage as well as later stage investment? Third is talent. So who actually builds the city themselves? Who staffs the city? Who is the administration? If we think about a NeWAY economic city, that's a city of 1.5 million people. If 5% of that population administers the city, that's 7,500 people. And if 10% of them are high skilled, then you have 750 people who you need to train to administer a city. Where do you get those people from? Unfortunately, Nigerian universities are not as good as they could be. You might be able to get some from Nigerians who went to school in the US or in Europe, but that's probably not enough. You probably don't want to hire from the Nigerian government because the Nigerian government is ineffective and you're trying to create a new, more effective system. So how do you actually get the sort of bureaucracy to build administer a charter city? And so with that, I'd like to conclude hearkening back to my first point of making bold plans. I think if we think about what the future looks like in 30 years, that's up to us. That's up to us sort of having an idea and working hard to implement it and figuring it out. And Africa, for example, is going to have 900 million new urban residents by 2050. And whether they have opportunities or whether they live in slums is the result of decisions that we will make now and into the future. And I think charter cities have the possibility of making a dent in that. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, particularly to Institut Ostrom Catalunya. And also just to briefly highlight, we've got our inaugural Charter Cities Conference coming up in Johannesburg on March 17th and 18th, chartercitiesconference.com. You can follow me on Twitter or the Institute. Find us on Facebook. Thank you.
Question. It seems to me from the 4 examples you gave us that things like democracy, women's rights, LGBT rights are not really needed to create such a development. So that seems, for me, like a little bit not dangerous, but interesting at the same time to see how such a dictatorship, I don't want to call it like that, maybe like Dubai, can thrive so much.
Sure. So Dubai is interesting because Dubai is probably the most liberal regime in the Middle East. If you go to Dubai, the only women who are wearing niqabs are tourists from Saudi Arabia. So while their women's rights might not be on par with Western country, they're probably much more advanced than most other places in the Middle East. I think more broadly, there is a question of right, like how do you actually structure these governments? And my preference is one with broad civil liberties as well as democracy. But what we're choosing to focus on is the economic aspect, because economic reforms tend to be a little bit less threatening than political reforms. Because if you have an area of a country where you have greater political reforms, then that might draw calls for broader political reforms throughout the country, which can threaten the sort of political equilibrium. While economic reforms, okay, that might lead to more economic reforms throughout the country, but tends to be a little bit less threatening to the political equilibrium than political or civil reforms. Generally, I'm a sort of believer in the modernization hypothesis, which is as people get richer, they tend to get a little bit more liberal. So if you look at, for example, right, Chinese cities, they tend to be more liberal. In rural areas in China, they're more accepting of gay rights and things like that. So I think getting people to live in cities and getting them richer does lead indirectly to these more civil liberties and political liberties. But it's as sort of a strategic matter, that's not what we choose to focus on.
You didn't mention NEOM in severally.
Yes.
And I don't know if you know the city. I was wondering if this city will be listed in these examples that you give.
Yeah, I think NEOM, I've listed it in past presentations. I mean, there's not that much to talk about with NEOM. So for those who don't know, NEOM is it's not a new city, it's a new region development in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government has committed investments of $500 billion. It's one of, I think, 3 mega projects that MBS is pushing to modernize Saudi Arabia. And my broad reading of the situation is that they, like everybody else in the Middle East, is terrified of what happens when nobody uses oil anymore. And so they're trying to modernize the economy, and NEOM is part of that. It's quite interesting because they do explicitly have this focus on governance. While most new city projects don't have a focus on governance, most new city projects only focus on the architecture. NEOM is explicitly thinking about governance. Some of their promotions, for example, have women wearing Western-style clothes. And so it does show, it is one of the counterexamples to my point of sort of economic reforms being important. That NEOM, they're also experimenting with some social reforms as well. I'm ultimately relatively skeptical about NEOM. I think it's a good attempt, but it's a very heavy lift. And right now it's basically being subsidized by oil. And the question is, when oil prices go down, the Saudi government basically has to bet on allowing women into the workforce because the men have not worked in 2 generations. I mean, some of the men have, but most of them haven't. And the women are the only people who actually want to work because it grants them a level of freedom that they've currently been closed off to them. So maybe it works, hopefully it works, but I don't think it has the right trend lines going for it.
I wanted to ask also if there's any case of failure city or failing city, like have you just touched about NEOM, or I don't know, maybe those cities in Nigeria that you mentioned, are they going to fail or are they going to be
We'll
like a survival bias, you know?
Yeah, there's definitely there's a lot of failed new cities. So the projects that we are working with, we think are going to succeed. We tend to prefer working with private sector projects because they have the cost-benefit analysis built into them. So I like to say there's 3 ways to build a city. You can be a government, in which case you can force all your bureaucracy to move. So that's like Abuja in Nigeria, Astana in Kazakhstan, St. Petersburg, built by Peter the Great, Brasilia. 2, you can start a religion. So this is Salt Lake City in Utah. I don't have that many other examples off the top of my head. And 3, you can have an economic reason, and this is typically ports or maybe a mine that enough people move there that it becomes a city. And our hypothesis is that if you have governance be effective enough, then that can be the economic factor to make a city successful. As 2 examples of failed cities, so King Abdul Economic City was a $100 billion new city in Saudi Arabia. It's the first city listed on the stock exchange, and it's basically failed because the mistake was that it wasn't $500 billion. Brasilia is a terrible city. It has one of the highest commute times for lower income residents because when they built it, they just didn't think about lower income residents at all. And you have a lot of, you have Masdar in Abu Dhabi, which they spent $20 billion building 4 square blocks. When I visited, I asked the PR guy, I was like, hey, some people say that this hasn't been as effective because you've invested so much money. I sort of gave him a softball question, but one I figured he had heard 30 times before, and he didn't have an answer for it, and I was like, okay, I feel kind of bad now. So you see a lot of Oftentimes they can be white elephants where government's like, I want to build up my home province, so I'm going to invest $5 billion there, but there is no actual economic rationale for there to be a new city there, and you end up getting a lot of buildings and a lot of streets with no traffic.
It would appear to me that the biggest challenge for a charter city, a proper charter city, is not so much a city, but the charter itself. And the biggest challenge that would be the local government. I mean, how do you keep out, the Honduran government from a Honduran special economic zone or area where you want to build your city?
So there's a few ways.
Violence and
Yeah, there's a few ways. First, I think you have to, you get them to be interested in the project in the first place. So basically the pitch is like, okay, we'll invest a few $100 million in this area and create a lot of jobs in exchange for the right to do labor law, business registry, etc. Then what you do is you want to have a revenue sharing agreement probably with the local government and the national government, so the state government and the federal government. So that way they're worried about killing the goose that killing the goose that lays the golden egg. You want to create a lot of jobs, primarily just because politicians don't like taking away jobs. You want to get the powerful business groups and powerful families in the country to invest because they tend to have political influence, and so if they have a stake in the project, and if the project is threatened, then they'll call up their congressman or equivalent to put pressure to not threaten the project. You can list the city after it's semi-successful on the stock exchange, in which case it will typically be bought by pension funds because they tend to have high influence in stock markets, and then the pension funds tend to be politically powerful. You can set up the concessions in a manner that if they are threatened or expropriated, you can sue, and if you win, you can confiscate overseas assets. But there's no silver bullet for this, and that is always a challenge, that if the government does feel that the city is threatening their power structure, they might want to revoke the concessions, or they might just not realize and revoke the concessions anyway. But I think the ultimate way you do it is you want to make it a source of pride for the country. So Robert Mugabe, who was the dictator of Zimbabwe, he died a year or 2 years ago. He died in a Singaporean hospital. And so, he runs a country for 30 years, and their hospitals are so bad that he goes to Singapore to do end-of-life care. And the person we're working with in Nigeria who's building the city, his kids are studying in the U.S., right? And so he's like, why are my kids studying in the U.S.? Like, I'm Nigerian. Nigeria is great. Like, why aren't our universities better? And so what we think is that if we can get charter cities to be places where leaders are comfortable sending their kids to school, where people are comfortable getting health care, and that creates a sense of pride, a sense of ownership, that can hopefully offset some of the other political urges that might be to sort of restrict the concessions and limit it, but by creating this sense of pride, by showing the best of what that kind of society can do, we think that's a way to help get around some of those challenges.
What about a foreign power like, say, the US or Britain, being behind the charter city and providing some sort of security there and saying, okay, if you mess with us, Honduras, we're going to kick your ass or something?
You could do that. We think that that's harder to start out with. We're proposing a public-private partnership between the developer and the government. Paul Romer's version was you have a high-income country administering a low-income country like Canada and Honduras, which, if people want to try that, good for them. I'm skeptical for two reasons. One, I think it'll be easier to do the public-private partnership because there you're not giving up sovereignty. Two, I don't actually think the Canadian government could administer a charter city very well. So what I would do along those lines is what you could do, for example, is you could get, if you get a lot of your investment from a sovereign wealth fund, say like Dubai or UAE, you could probably set up a bilateral treaty to protect the charter city. And that's not guns, but ultimately, if you get to the point where you have to use guns to protect it, I think you're going to lose. Like, it has to be built into the existing ecosystem well enough. And like, I don't, if there's a problem like I'm working on charter city gets to the point where there's like mercenaries being hired. Like I don't want to work on that project. I think if you set everything up right, then you can get enough buy-in that it's seen as something that the community likes.
I really like the point that you just raised because I think we're comparing two different kinds of charter cities. At the beginning, we talked about Singapore and Hong Kong, which are small states, not only cities but states that suddenly are alone and they have to improve all their institution structure and their economic structure in a sudden because they have to survive and they are under threat of actual invasion. But then we compare a second group of charter cities, which are cities that are inside bigger countries which have failed themselves to develop and have created these liberal sanctuaries. So why are charter cities a positive thing in this way if they represent both, like Singapore or Hong Kong, states that have actually developed a solid structure based on liberalism and fundamental rights, and at the same time, these cities inside hostile territories, for example, Saudi Arabia or Egypt, which both have failed to apply liberalism or fundamental rights in their countries, and yet they want to have these little sanctuaries that depart from a very sad premise, which is, okay, we're not able to apply this to our whole country, even if we want to, we're going to do it in a very small scale, not national scale, but provincial scale. Why do we foster this, or how do we frame this if we care for the development of that state? How is it not harmful to allow them to have a little part where everything is allowed and they have fundamental rights if the cost is that the rest of the country is even worse because you are concentrating all the good parts of, I mean, you just pointed the case of New Cairo, and New Cairo is accelerating incredibly the level of inequality in Egypt because all the rich people go there. So the metros, the bus stations, the energy facilities are all concentrated there. And Cairo is like a big ghetto of 20 million people because all the rich people have actually moved to New Cairo. So the rich people, that is the one that demands social change, the one that demands, as you say, decent universities, decent schools, decent hospitals, do not live there anymore.
Sure. So I think there's two questions. There's one is, I think in most circumstances it would be better to have the liberalization applied to the entire country, but oftentimes that's not politically feasible. And so the argument against that is that by allowing this sort of release valve in a charter city, you might not get political change that otherwise would have happened. But at least in a lot of parts of the world, we've seen 50, 60 years of a lack of political change. So at least let's try a new strategy. Second, the other part of your question I interpret as basically like, okay, there's the risk of charter cities becoming enclaves for the high income, where they just use this to go sort of run away from all of the existing challenges in a country. And that is a risk to a certain extent, right? Like you can definitely build charter cities for high income people. We're not really interested in that. So the sort of market for lower income people is much larger. There's a lot more lower income people in emerging markets than there are high income people. Second, I mean, one of the things we think about is like, how do you actually make these accessible to a much wider number of people? How do you push the price point down to increase the accessibility? We don't fully know at this point. I mean, if you look at Shenzhen, for example, right? Shenzhen, most of the people there were basically former peasants, or their parents were peasants. And that's more of the model of us than Dubai, where Dubai, a lot of the high-income people would be reasonably well off if they were in Europe, or if they were in Lebanon, they were still skilled. So Dubai hasn't had as much of an income effect as Shenzhen has had. Hong Kong, similarly, right? Like the people in Hong Kong were very poor, and now they're not as poor. So we see those more as inspiration more so than Dubai. And we think we can allow that by, right, one, if you get the incentives right, Toyota sells more cars than Mercedes, and Toyota hits a lower income segment in the market. So, right, you can build a much bigger city if you're targeting not just high income people, but also middle income and low income people. And second, just as a matter of personal choice, right, I'm much more interested in the projects that are targeting a broader market swath.
Of the projects that you mentioned for charter cities, which one would you say is the one that's closest to your ideal? And if you think it is related to the charter city project, well, I don't know if you've heard of the Liberland project, and well, you know, after they are really not allowed to get into that piece of land anymore. You know, they're trying things in Somaliland and something like that. So, do you feel some connection with them?
No.
With their idea? No, not at all. Okay.
So regarding Liberland, I see that, right, like to a certain extent they come off from a similar route. Right, you had the libertarian projects trying to start new countries by taking sand, putting on reefs in the 70s, like Republic of Minerva and Operation Atlantis, that sort of spawned into like seasteading. And Liberland sort of spawned off of that to a certain extent, that like ideology of creating something new from scratch. But I think the differences are, we're trying to be, I think, a lot more pragmatic, not ideological, right? Like I think markets generally work most of the time, but I'm not reading Rothbard to try to figure out what the legal system should be. Well, at least my interpretation is that Liberland folks like might be. I think they tend to be a little bit more like ideological pure, even if you did have a change of laws, right? What is it, like 7 square kilometers, basically like a muddy riverbank. Would people want to live there anyway? So thinking about location, I think, is important. The project I'm probably most excited for now, I like Inyimba, right? 1.5 million people is a lot. They are targeting a pretty wide range of incomes. They're going industrial, which I think scales better than some people are trying to jump straight to the service sector, which I think works, but it doesn't scale very well. And Inyimba has special economic zone status, so they do have some regulatory reforms that are already relatively deep.
Who's behind Inyimba?
A guy named Dara Uzu.
Nigerian?
Just Nigerian.
But nothing to do with the government?
It's private sector that they have government buy-in. The state government and the national government both have stakes in the project. The state government is helping with land acquisition, but it's a private project.
More questions? So thank you very much, and hope to see you again in the future conference that we will organize.
Thank you for coming.